Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to go over chapter 10 today, and we'll look at the nervous system, the brain, and the cranial nerves. You're not going to be responsible for the cranial nerves. Um, okay, so when we look at an overview of what you'll be expected to understand, is the brain itself, the protective structures, the divisions, and in terms of the divisions, the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. I'm not going to ask you to be responsible for any of the neuronal networks or the brain disorders or any of the cranial nerves. So let's get started. These are some of the key terms that we will be discussing and our learning objectives in terms of the overview of the brain. You will be given the locations of the four main divisions of the brain. You will be responsible for naming and describing the three meninges and the functions of the cerebral spinal fluid and where and how that fluid is formed. You'll also, under the cerebrum, you will be able to name and locate the lobes of the cerebral hemispheres and then cite the function of the cerebral cortex that's found in each lobe of the cerebrum. In the diencephalon, you'll be looking at the two divisions of the diencephalon and cite the functions of those, and as well as the brainstem, locating the three subdivisions of the brainstem and give the functions. And in terms of the cerebellum, again, to describe the cerebellum and identify the functions of it, you will not be responsible for the neuronal networks, as I had stated earlier. You will also not be responsible for the brain studies nor the disorders of the brain. You might want to read that, though. It might prove to be rather interesting given your line of work. You will not be responsible for the cranial nerves either. Okay, so let's get started here with the overview of the brain. The brain has the cerebrum, which is the largest portion of the brain, and it's common what you envision for the brain to look like. You're probably envisioning the cerebrum, and it has two lobes or two hemispheres, and those are divided into lobes, which I will look over. The cerebrum itself has an outer layer of gray matter that's called the cortex. It's a site for your conscious thought, your memory, your reasoning, and any abstract mental functions. And they're all found in each one of those lobes that we'll be discussing that are part of the cerebrum. The diencephalon is located between the cerebrum and the brain stem, and it contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is going to support and redirect any sensory input, and then the hypothalamus is responsible for homeostasis, and it controls some of the autonomic nervous system as well as the pituitary gland. So when we look at the brain itself, it consists of two central hemispheres and the diencephalon, the brainstem, as well as the cerebellum. Continuing on, when we look at the brainstem itself, it's subdivided into three parts: the midbrain at the top, the most superior, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So the brainstem connects the cerebrum with the diencephalon and the spinal cord. And the midbrain is our center for reflex as well as our vision and our hearing. The pons, it connects the cerebrum with the lower portion of the brain, and it helps to regulate respiration. However, the medulla oblongata really is the control center for our vital functions such as our respiration and our heart rate. Then we have the cerebellum, which is located posteriorly and in the back of the brain, and it's divided into two hemispheres. It will coordinate voluntary muscle control, and it maintains our balance. Okay, so here is an overview of what the brain looks like. And if you note that there's this area here of white matter that is actually joining the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, and this is called the corpus callosum. So if we look at the brain itself here, what you are seeing is a sagittal section. So the brain is divided in half longitudinally, and we have the right and the left hemispheres. And so the left and the right hemispheres here. So when we look at this, these are divided according to the location of that cut, that sagittal plane. And so you have the cerebrum up here, okay? And then we up inside of the cerebral hemispheres, we have the diencephalon, which houses the thalamus and the hypothalamus, okay? And then hanging off of that is the pituitary gland. Coming down and connecting with our spinal cord is the brain stem itself. The uppermost portion is the midbrain, and then we have the pons here, and then the medulla oblongata, and then that runs into the spinal cord. The cerebellum is at the posterior portion of the brain. Of course, all of this is encased in the cranium, and it is covered, the brain itself, with three outer tough coverings, which we will go over. So the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum, and what is connecting the brain to the spinal cord is the brain stem itself, okay? So when we look at the brain and the spinal cord, it is covered with a protective sheet of tissue, and it's divided into, or has, three layers. The outermost, toughest layer, which actually connects with the skull, is called the dura mater, and it has these sinuses. The arachnoid has some little projections that are connecting down to the pia mater, which is the innermost portion, which is attached to the brain. So here, when we look at the brain itself, we have a coronal section. So what you're doing here is you are cutting along and cutting down. And what you see is the skin. Then under the skin, we have, as you remember before, we have the periosteum, which is part of the bone covering, right? And then we have the skull. And then we have the three layers, which are covering the brain itself. The outermost, thickest layer is this blue called the dura mater. Then we have the arachnoid, which is the middle layer that has all of these little connections. And then we have the thinnest layer, which is actually attached to the brain itself, which is called the pia mater. So these three, the dura mater, which is the thickest, the arachnoid, and the pia mater, which is connecting to the brain, attached to the brain itself, are called the meninges. Then on the outside of our cerebral hemisphere, we have gray matter. And then inferior to that, in the interior of the brain, we have white matter. So the brain tissue is covered by both gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. So we have 3 layers there. Now, in order to protect the brain, we need some fluid, and the fluid is actually cushioning the brain against any forms of shock, or if you were to have a knock to the head or some kind of abrasion, then you are being cushioned. The brain is being cushioned by this cerebral spinal fluid, and that cerebral spinal fluid is actually being formed in and protecting the brain and the spinal cord, and it's produced by a capillary network, which is called the choroid plexus, which is found in the 4 ventricles of the brain, which are these spaces. So if we look at the cerebral spinal fluid, it's being produced in these 4 ventricles, and it's part of this choroid plexus, which is producing that fluid that is protecting the brain. We have 2 lateral ventricles, the foramina, and then the cerebral aqueduct. So if we look at the 4 fluid-filled spaces of the brain, as I said, we have 2 lateral, a third, and a fourth. The 4th ventricle actually is continuous down through the spinal cord. All of this is housing the cerebral spinal fluid, and where it's being produced is in this venous area of having veins, and it's called the choroid plexus. So that manufactures the cerebral spinal fluid. Again, it's supporting the brain, and it cushions it from shock. It also carries some nutrients to the cells, and it transports any waste away from the brain cells. So here is where you would find the ventricles, which are housing the cerebral spinal fluid. So there are 2 lateral ventricles here and here. Then you have this joint between those lateral ventricles, which is called the interventricular foramen. And then here, coming down, you have the cerebral aqueduct, okay? And then you have the 4th ventricle, which is continuous with the brainstem into the cerebral or into the spinal cord. So here's that choroid plexus, which is producing the area that is producing the cerebral spinal fluid. And if you note, it is all of that cerebral spinal fluid is circulating around the brain, the entire brain, and it is continuous with the spinal cord. So it's the 4th ventricle that here, if you look, the 4th ventricle here that is continuous with the spinal cord. Okay. So then what are the main divisions of the brain? So if we look at the main divisions of the brain, we have 2 cerebral hemispheres. We have the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And the names for the 3 layers of the meninges again, which is the doroid, the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. And then where is the cerebral spinal fluid formed? And it's formed in that capillary network that we call the choroid plexus. So which division of the brain is physically connected to the spinal cord? And again, you would have that as being the brain stem. So if we look at the cerebrum, that's the largest portion of the brain. We have several lobes that the cerebral hemispheres are divided into, and they're actually divided by these by these spaces, which we call sulci or a sulcus. And then we have some functions that we're going to be looking at in terms of the cerebral cortex in each one of the lobes. There are 4 lobes. So when we divide the two cerebral hemispheres, the right and left, which again are joined together by that corpus callosum, which is down deep inside of the cerebral hemispheres. Those cerebral hemispheres are then subdivided into 5 lobes. The frontal being in the front, the parietal are on either side of the central the central sulcus, and then we have the temporal, which are above, like our ears, the occipital, which is in the back, and then there's another one called the insula, which is deeper within the hemispheres, and we're not really certain the function of the insula. So the cerebral hemisphere has an outer layer of nervous tissue, which is consisting of the gray matter, and we call that the cortex. And as I said, our brain has a lot of folds, and they are gyri and then sulci. And then we have 2 divisions, or 2 very marked lines of separation, which are called the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus, which you'll see shortly in a drawing. So the internal layer of the cerebral hemisphere is primarily white matter. Around the cortex is the gray matter. And again, the central hemisphere, or the cerebral hemispheres, are connected by a bridge that sends network communication between the two hemispheres by this area that's called the corpus callosum. So if we look at the external surface of the brain, you'll note that we have all of these folds, and those folds are the gyri, and then dividing the left and the right central hemisphere, the left and the right central hemisphere is this longitudinal fissure, as you can see here, and it goes all the way through. Then we have some other fissures in the brain, and if we look at it from the side, we have this lateral sulcus, and then we also have that central sulcus, which runs along here, okay? And that divides us into a series of lobes in the brain. So we have what is in this orange color is called the frontal lobe. Then along the top on each side of the longitudinal fissure here are the parietal lobes. Then above our ear here, we have the temporal lobe. Then in the very back, we have the occipital lobe, and they each have their own functions, as well as the below the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, and then connecting with the spinal cord, we have the brain stem, which is divided into the pons, the medulla oblongata here, and then the midbrain is up within the cerebral hemispheres, which we cannot see here. So when we look at each one of the lobes, they have individualized functions. The frontal lobe is for motor and speech. The parietal, which are those that are on the top of the brain, on the top of our head, and on either side of that longitudinal fissure, that contains some sensory areas. Above our ears are the temporal lobes, and they are the areas for speech, comprehension, smell, as well as hearing. Then in the back, we have our sight, which is in the occipital lobe. So here we are with the functional areas of the brain. So this is the frontal lobe. So then here is the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and then the temporal lobe. And of course, that's the cerebellum. So if you look, we have a area that is in front of the central sulcus, and that is going to have a somatosensory area, and then which means that it is an area of sensation for our skin and feeling. And then we have that central sulcus here. In front of that is a motor area, primary motor area. And then we have this is for the motor speech, which we call the Broca area. And that is, all of this in orange is part of the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe in here. Okay, and then this is the central sulcus. So dividing the frontal lobe with the parietal lobe is this central sulcus. So motor speech and sensory information is here in the frontal lobe. Then we have other areas, but here we have the parietal lobe, which again, if you look back, the parietal is sensory as well. Okay. Then the temporal lobe is oftentimes, the way that I recall this is because of the closeness and proximity to the ear, so it has auditory and speech. This is what is developed, and in babies, they can understand the speech well before they are able to speak. In the back, on the occipital lobe, this is where we have our vision. Okay, so the vision is in the back in the occipital lobe. Okay, in order for us to learn, we have to commit to memory certain information. And what goes into our short-term memory is anything that is recited just a few times, and if you don't really repeat it over and over and over again, it does not go into the long-term memory. So something that you do again and again and again, that's going to go into your long-term memory. So it's rehearsed and through repetition that it is part of your long-term memory. But something that is not reinforced again and again and again only goes into our short-term memory, and it gets lost. So the four surfaces of the lobe, as you will recall, the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital, and then the thin outer layer of gray matter is the cortex. So then which lobes are separated by the central sulcus? So that would be going across the brain, not longitudinally. So that would be the frontal and the parietal. The diencephalon, the next section of the brain, has two divisions, and we'll go over their functions. And those two divisions are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the thalamus is responsible for sensory impulses, and it actually is like a relay center to send that information, those impulses, to the cerebral cortex itself. And that's part of the thalamus. Then the hypothalamus is responsible for maintaining homeostasis, for our body temperature, all of that kind of thing. And it controls both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Those things that we don't have to think about, like body temperature. And it also will influence our heartbeat, our blood flow, and our hormone secretion. So blood pressure. here is controlled by the hypothalamus, things that we're not thinking about. So if we look at the diencephalon itself, it consists of the thalamus and then the hypothalamus here, okay? And hanging off of that is the pituitary gland. So this is the diencephalon. This is a cross-section of the brain, and so this is only one of the cerebral hemispheres. This would be that little bridge if you were to have the other cerebral hemisphere attached here. This would be like the top of the longitudinal fissure of the brain, and that would be the corpus callosum. That is the bridge that would be joining those two cerebral hemispheres together. Then coming down, so this would be a longitudinal cut, and so then you would be dividing it into two parts. And then this would be the brain stem itself, which is divided into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And there's your cerebellum. Okay. So to what part of the brain is the pituitary gland attached? So the pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus. So then the two main portions of the diencephalon and what they do is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus, again, is responsible for sensory impulse and directing those impulses within the cerebral cortex, and the hypothalamus, again, for maintaining homeostasis, like blood pressure. Okay. Which structure controls the autonomic nervous system and the pituitary gland? So that would be the hypothalamus. Okay, the brainstem itself has three divisions, and those are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So let's kind of look at that. So the brainstem composed of the most superior portion, which is the midbrain. The pons is sectioned in between the midbrain and the lowest portion, which is called the medulla oblongata. So it connects the cerebrum, the main portion of our brain, the cerebrum, and the diencephalon, the middle portion of our brain, with the spinal cord. So that's what the brain stem does. And the brain stem itself has three sections: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And they have individualized functions as well. So the midbrain, as I said, is the most superior part of the brain stem. And it has four masses that are part of the midbrain, and it is involved in reflexing the eyes and the ears, and it is responsible for conducting any impulses from the cerebrum to the pons and the medulla and the spinal cord. So the pons now is that kind of bulb that hangs out further in that area, and it connects the cerebellum, which is on the back posterior part of the brain, and the rest of the nervous system, and it's going to regulate some of the reflexes that are involved in respiration. However, the medulla oblongata, which is the bottom portion of the brain stem before you get to the spinal cord, is the primary area for our autonomic nervous system, our respiratory center, our cardiac center, our vasomotor center, which is our blood pressure, and then for control of right and left sides of the brain. Okay, so then the three divisions of the brain stem are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And then which part of the brain stem contains the reflex centers for the eye and the reflexes? Those would be the midbrain. Okay, the cerebellum is on the posterior part of the brain and on the underside, and its functions are actually to coordinate any voluntary muscle control, and it helps primarily in balance. It's divided into three parts: a left and right hemisphere, and then anterior to that is the vermis. So if you look, it has the right and left hemispheres, and then the vermis on top. So primarily balance for the cerebellum. Okay, we're not going to be responsible for the limbic system and the neuronal networks. And however, you are responsible for some of these checkpoints here. No, I'm sorry, you're not going to be responsible for those because that deals with the limbic system. But which of the following is not a function of the cerebellum? And out of these, it would be initiating the movement of voluntary muscles. And you're not responsible for brain studies, brain imaging, and the disorders of the brain. However, I think that might be interesting for you to read over. Hydrocephala, stroke, tumors, hematomas, the different types, and some of the degenerative diseases. Okay. You're not responsible for any of the cranial nerves either. And that's it. So I hope that you have a nice day, and we will move on to chapter 11 next.